The cowboys laughed. At first, every morning, just after sunrise, she walked the same dirt path between the mess hall and the chicken coop, thin, quiet, face unreadable, and at every step she bowed, not once, not twice, 50 times. Low, deliberate bows to the guards, the cooks, even to the horses chewing hay nearby. The first time they saw it, the men on the porch cracked jokes. She worshipping the chickens? One chuckled. Another rolled a cigarette and smirked. Some kind of ninja ritual? But she never smiled, never paused, just bowed again and again, until one day, when a young ranch hand followed her, curious, and asked why, what he learned stopped him cold. Because it wasn't obedience, it wasn't submission, it was grief. Each bow was for someone she had lost. Her father, her sister, her country. 50 gone, 50 remembered, and suddenly, the men who mocked her stood in silence, their hats pressed to their chests. The girl who bowed had taught them how to mourn. She had not spoken since stepping off the truck. The heat rolled across the Texas flatlands like an oven door had been left open, but Katsumi moved through it as though untouched light, precise, detached. She wasn't tall enough to look most of the men in the eye, even if she had tried, but she never did. Her gaze was always slightly downcast, her spine straight, her movements tight and choreographed like she'd been trained not to exist loudly. Each morning, she emerged from the barracks just before reveal, her steps soundless against the gravel path. The mess hall was only a short walk away, but she turned it into a quiet pilgrimage. She would bow at the barracks door, then again at the guard post, again at the flagpole, and again and again. By the time she arrived at the food line, she had bowed close to a dozen times. And by the end of the day, if someone were counting, and eventually they did, she would have bowed 50 times, every day, without fail, without expression. At first, the Americans didn't know what to make of her. The ranch had been turned into a POW camp only months before guard towers hastily erected between hayfields and cattle pens. The cowboys who had traded saddles for sentry shifts were still adjusting to the surreal rhythm of peacetime imprisonment. They had expected something different, maybe hardened soldiers, maybe fanatics. Not thin girls with sunken cheeks and stiff bows. Not Katsumi. She's salutin' the dirt, one guard quipped. The first morning he saw her bend at the waist toward an empty fence post. The men chuckled, the kind of casual, uncomfortable laughter that fills the gap where understanding hasn't yet arrived. Bet she's trying to hypnotize us, another added, flicking a pebble toward her path. She didn't flinch, just bowed again and again. It was easy, in those early days, to reduce her to a joke. To the cowboys, the bowing felt performative, exaggerated, like someone play-acting humility or staging obedience for sympathy. She never spoke, never asked for anything, and never made eye contact. "Creeps me out, that one," muttered a cook one afternoon, watching Katsumi clear her plate with delicate precision, like a ghost that doesn't know she's dead. But she always cleaned up, always folded her blanket, always stood when spoken to, and always bowed. They had not been trained for this, not in boot camp, and certainly not on the ranch. The American guards were used to defiance, not devotion. They were taught to expect resistance, anger, contempt. Katsumi offered none of that. Her presence was a contradiction. She obeyed without ever appearing weak. She showed deference without ever seeming afraid. And so, slowly, the laughter began to fade, not because understanding had replaced it, but because repetition breeds discomfort. Watching someone repeat the same mysterious act every single day begins to scratch at the edges of conscience. It becomes harder to mock what you cannot explain. And still, she kept bowing. The cultural distance was so vast, so unspoken, that no one dared cross it. To the Americans, reverence was something saved for churches or the dead. To bow was to surrender. To bend was to yield. But for Katsumi, it was none of those things. Her world, the one she had come from, was built on layered rituals, some spiritual, some practical, all woven into a life that no longer existed. Each bow was a gesture to that vanished world, but the cowboys couldn't see that. Not yet. All they saw was a foreign girl nodding her head to no one. One night, under a rusted tin roof where the guards drank weak coffee and played cards, one of them asked aloud, "Why does she do it?" No one answered. A younger man said, "Habit, I guess." Another shrugged. "Maybe it's just what they do." But none of them knew, and none of them asked her. They just watched, and she bowed. Every morning, every night. Like the silence itself was sacred, like grief had a shape, like memory could be folded at the waist. 50 times, every single day. But that ritual hadn't started in Texas. It didn't begin in the dust of a foreign land or in the awkward silence of a prison camp. It began in the ashes of Hiroshima. Long before the ranch, long before the Cowboys, Katsumi had bowed not to confuse, not to obey, but to remember. In Japan, before everything burned, she had worn a different kind of uniform. White, crisp, plain. She had been only 16 when she was drafted into service as a nurse's assistant in a military hospital near the city's edge. Her hands were too small to carry stretchers alone, but steady enough to wash wounds and fold blood-stained sheets. Her world smelled of iodine and scorched cloth. There was no room for complaint, and certainly no space for fear. They were told to endure, to serve, to obey. The doctrine was clear. Bushido, the warrior code, did not belong only to the battlefield. It lived in kitchens, in clinics, in schoolrooms. Loyalty to the emperor came before all else. To survive without victory was shame. To be captured was worse than death. She had written those words once, in calligraphy, during a patriotic ceremony. She had bowed before the flag and promised to never dishonor her family by surrendering. That was before the rumors, before the noise, before the sky tore itself open. The morning it happened, she was folding linens near an open window. A faint breeze carried the scent of pine and river water, ordinary things. Then a white light erupted across the sky, so bright it cast shadows in reverse. There was no warning, no siren, just light, and then fire. Windows shattered inward, roofs lifted. Glass sliced the air like paper cranes. She awoke hours later beneath rubble, her left arm pinned, her ears filled with a ringing so loud it erased all thought. The hospital was gone. The people inside it, her superior, the boy with the burn dressings, the old woman who had whispered prayers in her sleep were gone too. Turned to smoke, flesh into ash. Katsumi stumbled through the streets, her shoes burned from her feet. The river swelled with bodies. Eyes stared without lids. Skin hung like paper draped over bone. The city was silent except for the moans of the dying and the distant crackle of flames that would not stop. And somehow, she had lived. She did not speak for 3 days. Not from fear, but because there was nothing left to say. Every word felt obscene. She wandered with the others who had survived, the ones called hibakusha. They drank from puddles. They ate nothing. They searched for names they would never find. That was when she began to bow. The first time was before a collapsed house where her childhood friend used to live. She bowed once. Then again. Her knees scraped the dirt. She whispered the girl's name. It felt wrong to walk away without acknowledgement. The next time, it was before a line of bodies laid out on a temple floor. She bowed for each one. By the end of the day, her back ached and her legs shook, but she kept going. The act steadied her. In a world without meaning, it gave her one: to carry the grief. The war ended. The emperor spoke. She was put on a list for repatriation. She was given a scratchy uniform, a biscuit, and a place on a ship heading east. And every day aboard that vessel, as the ocean swayed beneath her, she bowed quietly to the waves, to the wind, to the memory of those who could not leave, 50 times, one for each name she could remember, and some for those she had never known. The guards thought her strange. The other women watched in silence. But Katsumi didn't do it for them. She did it because she had survived, and survival, in her world, demanded atonement. In Texas, that ritual followed her like a second skin. The cowboys saw a habit. They saw submission. But what they missed, what they could not yet see, was the shadow of Hiroshima in every motion. Each bow was a scar, each bend a memory. She was not honoring her captors, she was mourning the dead, and the shame of surviving their fire lived in every inch of her spine. When the truck rolled through the wooden gates of the Texas camp, Katsumi didn't lift her head. Her eyes flickered over the horizon, registering the colors and shapes without letting them sink in. Fields of dust and dry grass, long shadows cast by leaning barns, fences that looked more like cattle pens than prison walls. There were no towers, no floodlights, no snarling dogs or coiled wire. A ranch, they called it. But to her, it was only the unknown. The truck halted beside a windmill that clinked softly in the breeze. The doors opened. The light was warm, not cruel. A breeze carried the scent of hay and manure, and beneath it, something else bred, maybe meat. She stepped down slowly, one bare foot after the other, as if the ground itself might betray her. They were not greeted with guns, not with barking orders. The American guards stood with rifles slung over their shoulders, not raised. One cowboy squinted at her, then looked away, as though embarrassed to have seen her face. Another handed her a blanket, worn but clean. She took it without bowing that time, her hands trembling slightly as they closed around the cloth. A guard gestured toward the barn where she would sleep. No shouting, no kicking, just a nod. That confused her more than cruelty ever could. Inside, the barrack smelled like wood and dust, not antiseptic or blood. A small bed weighted thin mattress, wool blanket, a folded shirt on top. There was a window, not barred, just glass. She ran her finger along the sill. Dust came away in a soft film. For a moment, she thought of the hospital back home, its windows shattered by fire. She blinked, but did not cry. There was no sense in tears. Instead, she bowed once deep and silent to the bed, then sat on its edge, rigid as a soldier. Sleep would not come easily. That night, music drifted in through the cracks in the wall. Not drums, not anthems. A harmonica, slow and off-key, played something soft and circular. She didn't understand the melody, but it tugged at something inside her. Another woman near her whispered, "They sing." Katsumi said nothing. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her body and stared at the wall. Music, real music, felt indecent. She had last heard it in a childhood memory she no longer trusted. The sound curled around her like steam, comforting and disorienting at once. The food, too, felt like a trick. They served her something thick and red-brown in a tin bowl. Stew, they called it. She stared at the chunks of meat and carrot, the oily surface glistening like something obscene. Her fingers hovered over the spoon. The smell was unbearable, rich and alive. She took a single bite, and felt her stomach twist, not in rejection, but in recognition. Her body remembered, but her mind screamed against it. She finished the meal in silence, cheeks flushed with shame. What would her mother have done for this bowl? What would her sister have traded? Still, she could not trust it. Not yet. The Americans were too calm, too polite. That frightened her more than if they had struck her. Every morning, the guards made their rounds with mechanical precision, checking off names, nodding without sneering. One even smiled once, offering her a second slice of bread. She took it, bowed deeply, and turned away before he could see the tears rise behind her eyes. Was it mercy? Was it manipulation? She didn't know. So she kept her head down, performed her chores with perfection, and bowed to everyone, to everything, hoping it would be enough to keep her safe. This place, this strange, quiet land, made her feel like she was walking on glass. The floor was not supposed to hold. At night, she lay awake, waiting for the blow that never came, a shouted insult, a slap, a punishment. None arrived, only crickets and cattle sounds in the dark. Peace, she thought, was the most dangerous thing of all, because peace could vanish, and the moment you believed in it, that was when the world burned again. So she did not believe. Not yet. She only bowed, 50 times, every day, because in a place with no bombs, it was the only weapon she had left. It started with a whistle. One morning, as Katsumi bowed to a wooden post by the stables, one of the cowboys leaned back in his chair, spit a line of tobacco into the dirt, and whistled a little tune, 2 high notes, then a low one, like a bird call wrapped in mockery. The others glanced over. A moment later, the line formed. "You missed that bucket, Miss Japan." Laughter followed, low and amused. She didn't respond. She didn't pause. She bowed again, this time to the hitching rail, and continued walking, her tray balanced carefully between her hands. Another guard muttered, "She bows more than the preacher back home," and the chuckles grew. By the end of the week, it had become a kind of entertainment. She bowed to a chicken coop yesterday. One cowboy reported over coffee. "I swear if you put a stick in the ground, she'll bow to it before noon." They kept count some mornings, betting over how many she'd get through before breakfast. 50. Always 50. No more, no less. They joked that maybe she was doing math. Maybe she was casting spells. One guard started to bow back, exaggerated and slow, arms wide like a stage actor. Another tied a handkerchief to a broomstick and planted it outside the kitchen. "Let's see if she salutes our flag too," he said, grinning. Katsumi never reacted. Not once. Her face remained a still pool. But inside, each snicker scraped something raw. She had no words to defend herself. No language strong enough to carry the weight of her grief across the divide. So she bowed, not because she accepted the joke, but because it was all she had left of a vanished world. To them, it was comedy. To her, it was ritual, a way to name the dead without speaking, a way to stay small and safe, even as the ghosts grew louder behind her eyes. She had been taught that humility was strength, that dignity lived in the spine, bowed with intention, not broken by force. But here, that reverence was mistaken for weakness. Her silence looked like submission, her grief like superstition. She felt it happening, her meaning slipping from her hands like water, replaced by their laughter. And yet, she could not stop. To stop bowing would be to forget. And forgetting was the only unforgivable sin. The guards didn't mean cruelty. Not really. It wasn't malice. It was ignorance, wrapped in nervous smiles. They had never seen mourning take this shape. In their world, Grief came with black veils and solemn hymns, not the quiet repetition of a bent back. None of them had ever lost a city. None had knelt beside a river filled with floating bodies. They saw a girl who bowed to boots and trees, and they didn't ask why. They assumed the world made sense. That kindness, once offered, should be enough to erase the past. But they didn't know what she had seen, what she carried, what she was trying to remember, bough by bough. One afternoon, as she lowered herself toward a bucket by the laundry shed, a voice behind her called out, "You gonna bow to my boots next, sweetheart?" She froze, her shoulders tense, but then continued her motion, slow and deliberate. The laughter that followed was scattered, uneasy. One guard, younger than the rest, shifted where he stood and muttered, "Maybe she's got her reasons." No one replied. They didn't ask. Not yet. They just laughed, softer now, as if unsure whether the joke was still funny. And she walked on, carrying her silence like a lantern in the dark. Will had never paid her much attention before. Not really. She was just one of the quiet ones, thin as wire, always working, always bowing. He had laughed like the others. Not loudly, but enough to blend in. That was the way of things on the ranch. Keep your boots dusty, your head low, and don't ask questions that didn't need asking. But that morning, something was different. He was leaning against the post outside the mess hall, sipping the end of his coffee, when he saw her pause by the rain barrel. She bowed, then walked 6 steps, paused again, and bowed once more. He tilted his head, and then he started counting. 1, 2. At the flagpole. 3. To a guard who didn't notice. 4. To the old, cracked watering trough. She wasn't rushing. Each movement was slow, methodical, the kind of slow that wasn't laziness but intention. Like each bow had a weight to it. By the time she made it to the chicken coop, he was up to 37. She wasn't performing for anyone. Most of the men weren't even looking anymore. The joke had worn thin. But she kept going, unbothered, untouched by their gaze. Will stood in silence as she dipped her head one more time, 49. Then again at the door to the mess hall. 50. Exactly 50. He blinked, lips parting slightly. Why 50? Later that day, he followed her at a distance. Not out of suspicion, not out of duty, just curiosity, raw and gnawing. He watched her hang laundry with the other women, silent but deliberate. She folded towels with geometric precision, adjusted the lines so the cloth didn't touch the dirt. Each act was exact, almost reverent. He'd seen nuns move that way once, in New Mexico. Everything touched with care, as if the object held a soul. That night, he didn't tell anyone what he saw. He just lay in his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, turning the number over in his head like a coin. The next morning, she bowed 50 times again. And the next, always 50. Will stopped laughing altogether. He began to look for the pattern, where she bowed, when, if she ever skipped. She never did. The places weren't random either. She bowed to things that had names, or memories, or edges. Posts, tools, thresholds, people, never trees, never sky, always things, always purpose, and never eye contact. Not once. There was something sacred about it, he realized. Something sad. She wasn't strange. She was grieving. That truth sank into him like a stone in water. Slow but irreversible. He didn't know who she was mourning, didn't know her story. But something in her movements so quiet, so constant, began to hollow out a space in him he didn't know was there. The same way the fields felt different after rain, familiar but heavier. One evening, as she passed the barn and bowed to the horse stall, he stood just inside, holding a bale of hay. She didn't see him, or maybe she did, but the bow came anyway, deep, slow, measured. He didn't move, just watched, and something in him whispered, "Don't laugh. Not ever again." The next morning, when another guard cracked a joke, "Think she's gonna hit 60 today?" Will didn't smile. He just said, "It's always 50, and walked away. Nobody replied. From that day on, he kept count silently, not for amusement, but because it mattered. Because grief, even in silence, demands to be witnessed. Will waited until the afternoon sun dipped low enough to soften the dust in the air. He had watched her all morning, counting in his head as he always did now. 50 bows. Always 50. Never 49. Never 51. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence, too heavy to be habit. He told himself he was just curious. That was easier than admitting the truth that the ritual had begun to haunt him. When the moment came, it was almost accidental. Katsumi was standing near the water barrels, rinsing a tin cup with careful movements, her posture straight despite the long day. Will hesitated, then stepped closer. He cleared his throat. She stiffened immediately, shoulders tightening as if bracing for a blow. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, the universal gesture of harmless intent. "Why?" he began, then stopped. His voice felt clumsy in his mouth. He gestured vaguely, then bowed, awkward, crooked, nothing like her smooth motion. "Why you do that?" He tried again. The bowing. She did not answer at first. Her eyes flicked away, scanning the dirt, the fence line, anywhere but his face. He thought she might retreat, that the moment had passed. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, worn thin by use and disuse both. "For them," she said. "For who?" he asked, softly. She hesitated. Her hands trembled once, then folded together. "For the ones who did not come back." He waited. The wind stirred dust between them. Somewhere a horse snorted. She swallowed, then spoke again, slowly, choosing each word as if lifting something heavy from the ground. "I count them," she said. "Each bow, one name, one life." Will felt something tighten in his chest. "How many?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She looked up then, her eyes dark and steady. 50, she said. "My family, my patients, my neighbors, people I knew, people I did not know." Her voice wavered for the first time. "They died. I lived." The silence that followed pressed down on them both. The wind carried the smell of hay and dust, but suddenly it felt heavier, like the air before a storm. Will opened his mouth to speak, and found he couldn't. The words lodged somewhere behind his ribs. He thought of the jokes, the laughter, the way he had watched her bow and thought it strange, maybe even foolish. He thought of the way she never met his eyes, not out of fear, but because she was looking inward, counting the dead, counting them so they would not disappear. "I'm sorry," he said at last. It sounded small, inadequate, but it was all he had. She nodded once. Not in gratitude, not in forgiveness, simply in acknowledgement. That evening, Will told the others, not loudly, not with drama, just quietly, as they sat on overturned crates near the barn, the sky bleeding orange into dusk. He told them what the boughs meant. He told them about the counting, about the dead. about the weight she carried every morning before breakfast. At first, no one spoke. One man scoffed, then stopped himself. Another stared at the ground. A third pulled off his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. No one laughed. No one joked. The story settled among them like dust after a long drought. The next morning, when Katsumi stepped out of the barracks, she stopped short. The men were standing in a loose line along the path, not blocking her, waiting. When she bowed the first time, none of them moved. But on the second, something changed. One by one, awkwardly, unevenly, they bent their heads. Not deeply, not perfectly, but enough. She froze. The moment stretched. Then she bowed again, and they bowed back. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that silent exchange, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. For the first time since she arrived, she was not alone in her ritual. The weight she carried did not vanish, but it was shared. And for the men who had laughed, who had mocked without understanding, the act cost them something too. It required humility. It required seeing her not as a curiosity or a captive, but as a human being carrying a grief too vast to name. From that day on, the bows continued, and so did the counting. But now, when Katsumi lowered herself toward the earth, she was no longer the only one remembering. They didn't plan it. There were no orders, no announcements, no instructions tacked to the bulletin board. But that morning, the camp was quieter than usual. The wind rustled the cottonwood trees. A horse whinnied somewhere in the distance. And as Katsumi stepped out of the barracks and walked her morning path, the men were already there, spaced out along the trail, standing near the hitching post, by the kitchen door, beside the faded American flag. She didn't slow her steps, didn't pause, but when she bowed once, deep, at the gate, they each responded, not perfectly, not in unison, but enough. Their heads dipped, hands twitched uncertainly at their sides. Some bent only slightly, others more deliberately. A few, like Will, did it with quiet reverence. The rest did it clumsily, unsure of the form, but trying anyway. Trying mattered. She walked on. The second bow came by the corner of the stables, as always. And again, movement. The men followed her rhythm, not mockingly, but softly. Even the barn cat that she always nodded to sat unusually still on the fence post, as if sensing something had shifted in the air. By the time she reached the mess hall, she had bowed 12 times, and 12 men had bowed back. Katsumi's hands didn't tremble that morning. She moved like water. Each bow a smooth unfolding of the spine, a quiet prayer etched into muscle memory. But beneath her stillness, something stirred. Not confusion, not fear. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. Later, during chores, she noticed it again. Men who used to whistle or mutter or joke now fell quiet when she passed. One of them, older, with a limp and dust-caked boots, offered her a bucket without a word. He didn't smile, didn't look her in the eye, but his silence felt different now. Not avoidance, respect. That evening, Will sat with her translator, a young Nisei volunteer from California, and asked, "Do you think she noticed?" The translator nodded. "Of course," he said. "She notices everything. That's the kind of silence she lives in." Word spread slowly through the camp, not through meetings or memos, just in the way stories do passed hand to hand, like water in a drought. "She bows for the dead," someone whispered. "One for each." That was all they needed to know. The laughter stopped altogether. and in its place came something rarer stillness. It changed them. The ritual that once seemed foreign became familiar. The distance between captor and captive, soldier and prisoner, narrowed with each bend of the spine. It was never perfect. Some men still looked away, unsure what to feel. Others bowed too deeply, as if overcompensating. But the effort mattered. Katsumi saw it, and she responded in kind, not with words, but with presence. She walked slower now, looked longer. Her eyes, once downcast always, began to lift. There were still no shared meals, no long conversations. But when she passed the blacksmith and he nodded once without speaking, she nodded back. Something small had shifted. A ritual meant to hold the past had become a bridge to the present. A language not of grammar or vocabulary, but of shared motion, shared respect. It did not erase what had happened. It did not resurrect the dead. But it made space for something else to grow: empathy, perhaps, or dignity, or a kind of truce neither side had words for. The bows continued. 50 each day. But now, each one was echoed. And in the silence between the motions, something sacred settled into the dust of the camp, proof that understanding doesn't begin with language. It begins with the willingness to kneel. They gave her paper one morning, folded neatly beside her tray at breakfast. A small pencil, worn from use but still sharp, was tied to it with a thin strand of twine. No one said anything. There was no ceremony, no speech, just the quiet gift of a blank page. Katsumi held it for a long time before moving. The men pretended not to watch, but they were watching. Especially Will. She carried it back to the barracks like a relic. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with weight. What do you say? When words have been denied for so long, when silence has done all the speaking. That night, under the flickering lamplight, she began to write. The first word was a name her sister's, then her parents', then the address she remembered, though the building might no longer stand. Each stroke of the pencil felt like breathing after holding it for too long. The curves of the kana were steady, though her hand was not. She told them she was alive, that the camp was not what they had feared, that the men who had once laughed now bowed with her. She wrote about the fields, the horses, the sky so wide it made her feel small in a way that didn't hurt. And she wrote about the bows, 50 each morning, one for each soul she lost. She wrote how the Americans had asked why, how they listened, how they did not laugh anymore. I did not expect them to understand, she wrote, but they did, in their own way, and when they bowed back, I knew I was not alone. That line, she underlined. The letter, more prayer than message, unfolded slowly. She told them about Will, not his name, just his presence. That there was a young man who no longer looked through her, but at her, who counted bows not as absurdity, but as memory made visible. She did not say she trusted him. That would be too much. But she said he listened, and that was enough. To write was to remember, and to remember was to resist erasure. Each word was a tether to the past, a way of naming what the war had tried to strip from her. In the stillness of that barracks, pencil whispering across paper, Katsumi was no longer just surviving. She was telling. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud in a letter, but between the lines, she wove them. She wrote of dignity regained, not by freedom, but by being seen. She wrote of mornings that hurt less, of rituals that no longer felt like solitary burdens, but shared offerings. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that the letter would reach them, that someone would open it, that someone would read and know she was still here, still bowing, still remembering, still living. When she sealed the letter and handed it to the guard, he took it without a word. But before walking away, he paused, gave a small, stiff bow, barely a nod, but enough. She returned it. That was their language now. A few days later, another woman asked for paper. Then another. A ripple began. One quiet voice becoming a chorus, each letter its own kind of resurrection. And in the camp, something else was growing. Not comfort, not friendship, but humanity. The kind that does not need to be declared, only lived. If this story moves you, please like the video and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Because somewhere, someone may still be waiting for a letter, and maybe, just maybe, a bow. The oak stood at the edge of the field where the earth sloped gently downward, its roots thick and gnarled, its branches wide enough to cast shade even in the harsh afternoon light. It had been there long before the camp, long before the fences and guard towers and rows of bunks. It had watched wagons pass and cattle graze. It had weathered storms without comment. To Katsumi, it felt like a witness, old, patient, unjudging. She came to it one morning carrying a small bundle of stones in the fold of her jacket. Smooth ones, pale ones. Some she had picked from the creek bed, others from the dusty road. Each one chosen carefully, as if it already belonged to a name. She knelt at the base of the oak and began to place them, one by one, in a wide circle around the trunk. The first stone went down gently. She bowed. The second followed. Another bow. She did not rush. The ritual was slow, deliberate, reverent. Each stone marked a life, a face, a voice she could still hear if she let herself. She whispered nothing, but her lips moved faintly as though counting names only she could hear. When she reached the 50th stone, she paused longer than before. Her shoulders trembled, just slightly. Then she bowed again, deeper than all the rest. The wind rustled the oak's leaves overhead, scattering light across the earth like fragments of memory. She did not know when the men began to notice. Perhaps they had been watching all along. At first, they stayed back, leaning against fence posts or pretending to fix something nearby. But as the days passed, the circle of stones grew impossible to ignore. It was not a grave, not exactly. There were no markers, no dates, no names carved in stone. And yet, it felt heavier than any cemetery they had known. One afternoon, Will approached the tree alone. He stopped several paces away, hat in his hands. The stones formed a near-perfect ring, each placed with care. He stood there a long time, feeling something tighten in his chest. He thought of the people he'd lost, friends who never came home, letters that stopped arriving, faces that had faded from memory without ceremony or marker. He had never mourned them properly. There had been no time. That night, under cover of dusk, he returned. In his pocket was a thin piece of wire he'd twisted into a simple shape. He knelt at the edge of the circle and placed it gently against the trunk of the oak. It was nothing ornate, just two lines crossing. A mark, a sign, not of religion, but of recognition. He did not tell anyone. The next morning, Katsumi noticed it immediately. She froze when she saw the small wire cross resting among the stones. Her breath caught. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and bowed, deeper than she ever had before. She did not touch the cross. She did not remove it. She simply accepted it, the way one accepts rain or sunrise, a gesture offered without demand. a mourning answered by another. Word spread quietly. No one spoke of it outright, but everyone knew. The oak had become something else now, not just a tree, a place of remembering. When the men passed it, they removed their hats. Not because anyone told them to, but because it felt right. Some would pause there at dusk. Others left small tokens, a smoothed stone, a carved notch in the bark, a folded scrap of paper. The camp had found its heart, and it beat beneath that tree. Katsumi continued her bows, but now they were not alone. Sometimes a man would bow with her. Sometimes he would only lower his head. Sometimes he would just stand still, hands at his sides, eyes closed. That was enough. The war had taken so much homes, names, futures. But in this small clearing, something had been given back. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but acknowledgement. And in that shared silence, among stones and soil and the memory of those lost, the living learned how to remember together. The day came quietly. No announcements, no fanfare, just a clipboard passed between guards, a list checked, a name called. Katsumi was to be repatriated, sent back across the ocean, back to a country that barely resembled the one she left behind. Her body was different now, healthier. She had gained weight. Her cheeks, once hollow, held shape. Her uniform, crisp and clean, no longer hung off her like cloth on a skeleton. But her eyes, they still carried the same shadows. Memory doesn't vanish with food or fabric. She packed her things in silence. A folded paper crane, a smooth stone from beneath the oak, the pencil stub, worn nearly to nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just bowed once to her bunk, her folded blanket, the window that overlooked the field where she had once feared peace might be a trick. The truck rumbled at the edge of the camp, dust curling around its wheels. A few others were being transported that day, but Katsumi stood slightly apart, not out of pride, out of reverence. This was a funeral of sorts, not for a person, but for a chapter of life that had somehow grown roots in unlikely soil. She made her way toward the gate slowly, each step heavy with meaning. Men gathered without speaking, guards, cooks, cowboys. Will was there, arms folded, hat in hand. No one reached out. No one interrupted. They just watched as she reached the center of the camp and turned around. Then she bowed. It was not the bow of a prisoner, not the ritualistic dipping she had done every day. This was different, deeper, slower. A full bend from the waist, held long enough for the wind to rustle the edges of her sleeves. A bow of gratitude, of goodbye, of grace. And then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the men stepped forward. They did not speak. They did not smile. But each of them, slowly, deliberately, bowed back. Not mockingly, not awkwardly, not as a joke or an echo, but fully, deeply. Some held their hats to their chests. Others kept their hands by their sides, but every single one of them bent toward her, as if the soil itself had taught them what honor meant. She rose, eyes glistening, though no tears fell. Her face held stillness, peace. She turned, walked through the gate, and climbed into the truck. As the engine started, the wind carried with it the soft scrape of boots in dirt, the creak of knees bending, the shuffle of men learning reverence too late and yet just in time. No one said her name, but everyone remembered it. That night, the oak tree stood quietly in the field. The stones were still there. So was the cross. Will passed by, tipped his hat toward the empty circle, and bowed alone now, but not lonely. He understood something he hadn't before. That memory is not just what we keep, but what we share, what we choose to carry forward, even when the one who taught us is gone. The war would end, the camp would close, the fences would fall, but the ritual, the small, daily reverence for the weight of loss would stay. Because of her. If this story meant something to you, like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering what history tried to forget.